Thanks, everybody, for attending today. I know it's a bit early for some, particularly for those who have traveled thousands and thousands of miles. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce, to those of you who don't know him, Professor Kiran Jarayam, who started his anthropological career here at the University of Kansas and then went on to do his doctorate at Columbia. And I've been delighted in terms of being associated with some of his work, making anthropologists. We had a project that he directed in Haiti, and Michael Crawford was centrally involved in that, and maybe you'll say something about that. But without further ado, Professor Jarayam, who teaches at the University of South Florida.
Thank you, Bart. Bart's the one who got me into anthropology, so if I make a mistake, it's his fault. No, it's an honor to be here among you all, colleagues, students, peers. It's a great honor to be here. I'm apologizing for being a few minutes late and the technical issues. As Bart talked about, he and I were involved in a Wenner-Gren program from 2014 until about 2017, 2018, working on international educational development and working on developing a doctoral program at the State University of Haiti at the Faculté d'Ethnologie. And that was part of the inspiration for my latest research agenda. This research, which is the pilot data. So this is called Making of Anthropologists in the Dominican Republic. To put this in context, there have been changes in digitized technologies and transportation to facilitate increased awareness of global connections, not necessarily, as some people have talked about, as being an unprecedented connection, because 100 years ago they were saying the same thing. But this awareness of connections has been increased. This applies also to academic knowledge production too, is because of the internet we can share articles and whatnot. And these changes have combined with certain political engagements and scholarly critique to end colonial vestiges and to reproduce and produce calls for reforming systems of knowledge production like universities. So the overall research question is, what are the cultural dynamics involved in training anthropologists? Now, there are a few problems and possible directions that this research could take at a later stage, but that's not what I'm going to talk about here. On one point, there's been some increase, in particular in the past 20 years, of histories of anthropology and examinations of the histories of anthropology of a particular place or global connections. Akhil Gupta has written several pieces, and his AAA 2021 address was talking about decolonizing anthropology and what that would look like. He had an article about 10 years ago on the role of the US scholarship on India and whether it was imperialist or irrelevant. The issue with a lot of these, as well as some other things that have been written in Vibrant, a Brazilian anthropological journal on Indian anthropology and elsewhere, is that it's oftentimes just anecdotal. There's really very little work that's solid, rigorous social science on anthropology, on how anthropologists are made, on the actual work. Not in the schools of education where you thought it might be, not in departments of anthropology where it should be. There has been an exception of Hoda Bandeh Ahmedi, who's an Iranian American who did her dissertation in 2018 at University of Michigan, who actually wrote on 2 state universities and 1 central university in northern India. It's very interesting work. The research could go in the direction of looking at the institutional history. It's relevant to say, for example, in certain colonial settings, the licencia in the Americas or the licence in the French system was the highest degree possible. So if someone attained the licencia or licence, which is an undergraduate degree, what we would call in the United States, that was considered the professional credentialization. I'm not going to talk about that any more than I already have. That's one possible direction to look at. Another would be the pre-enrollment conditions and the student motivations for getting a graduate degree in anthropology. Very interesting in the Dominican Republic, as I'll show, the students who are in that master's program are actually more like undergraduates, and those that are in undergraduate, the licence, are actually more professional. It's very kind of interesting that way. And in India, there's the issue of the economics of the domestic unit. In other words, people's parents kind of saying, no, you're not going to get an undergraduate degree in anthropology. That doesn't get you a job. You want a job, you go to medicine, you go to engineering. Then after you have that, you can get a job. Study whatever you want. So this sort of domestic economics, as well as the lack of the opportunity for students to study outside and or work outside the home and get jobs to pay for their own schooling, is one of the sort of limits to who gets to study anthropology, who's motivated to do what, to some degree. But those are just some of the limitations. The work deals with my project with world anthropologies, which is effectively just recognizing that anthropology exists and there are traditions outside of the North Atlantic, outside of the US and UK and France and perhaps Germany. And there's oftentimes, over the past 30 years, have been the statement of a goal to decolonize, to create an equitable space for an exchange of ideas, much like we very much tried to do with this event. This project also speaks to the anthropology of higher education, where you look at universities as a research site and their actors as distinct populations, but you still, very much like a traditional anthropology, you want to look at the global and local connections. So it's not just looking at a classroom as its own entity without looking at how it fits into the larger picture. And lastly, this addresses some works in science and technology studies. Obviously, Bruno Latour figures largely in this with some of his work on lab life. But even much earlier, there was Anne Rowe, who was a psychologist who was, I think, at Harvard, wrote back in the late 1950s a book on making scientists. And she did kind of a psychological profile of different scientists, including social scientists and natural scientists and anthropologists specifically. So it kind of speaks to some of that literature. My work in India was in 2 state universities, not a central university or like a federally funded university in South India. These offer programs in graduate degrees in anthropology. I did research, ethnographic research in October 2022, and also have been continuing to do a website and document analysis since then. In the Dominican Republic, one was the State University, Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo, which was the oldest university in the Americas. It's now public. It used to be a Catholic institution. And then I also looked at a private university that offers courses in anthropology and a doctoral program in social sciences, which interestingly doesn't have any anthropology or sociology in it. This was collaborative, this project in Dominican Republic with my colleague in the College of Education. We did also ethnography and website and document analysis, and we did some field recordings, which we're still in the process of going through. Briefly, the results here, if you look at teaching, learning, and curriculum, why do I separate out teaching and learning? Because if you've ever taught a course, you understand that you're teaching something and the students don't necessarily learn what you're teaching. So those are 2 separate things that need to be examined. The teaching styles in India vary by faculty member. There's no necessarily uniform set of practices. There was a mention by a few people of this guru-shishya relationship, which comes from Hinduism, and the guru knows everything, and he's the dispeller of darkness for the student who's in darkness. And so there's very much like a Paulo Freire banking system of education where the teacher makes a deposit into the student. The staple for teaching is the lecture and the chalkboard, although there are limited moments of discussion, but it's more of one-line type discussions. And for the students, they get their books from the library in India. There are some internet searches, and there's some small group work after class. Now, the way that students are evaluated in India is distinct from the way they are in the Dominican Republic, in the United States, and Haiti. And Bart and I had an issue when we were evaluating students for our project in Haiti years ago, when they said, well, just send us the grades. And we're like, well, what's the grading, how do you do a grade? Because a grade is not just a grade. If they say 90, well, in the French system, that would be nearly impossible, so it's, but that's a whole other topic. But they do work together in small groups to try and figure out things together, almost like a cohort. And the curriculum, when you look at all of the courses, and even they have bibliographies for the courses. For the master's, for the graduate program, there are very few specialized courses. They tend to be generally theory, foundational theory, modern theory, methods, and they don't really go much further into that. And then there's thesis work. A lot of the readings are dated, going back to mid-20th century. There's very little contemporary work. 21st century readings practically don't exist in these curricula. And the choices seem somewhat idiosyncratic in that you can't really discern a particular conceptual approach or even a reasoned diversity of approaches. Within that curriculum, you can see a major influence of US canon, some Indian works, particularly in the forensic and applied areas, and some British readings. In the Dominican Republic, there were student-led presentations with little intervention from the instructor. There were long lectures with practically no intervention from students, just kind of sitting there listening. And as far as learning, the students used WhatsApp groups to communicate with their peers and their instructor. Google was the number one source for information. And there was no use of libraries, despite some of the courses actually having outings to libraries and archives integrated into the course. I haven't had a chance to ask if they actually go there, but clearly this is not built into the idea of the program of going to libraries, going to reach out to these physical places. Lastly, for the curriculum, it also seems dated and somewhat idiosyncratic. So, for example, there was in the same course readings by Samir Amin, who is obviously a very critical Marxian approach, Roy DeAndrade, which is the kind of psychological anthropology, and then Arjuna Padarai, who comes from the late 20th century in his ethnoscapes and his approaches to violence. So it's kind of curious who gets put into what course. And in the Dominican Republic, there's a mix of US, Spanish, Mexican, and sometimes French scholars, particularly the sort of typical French anthropology or social scientist. You would think Pierre Bourdieu, you have Foucault. So those are kind of the general things that I've discerned from this research. So to conclude, or to discuss first, each of these sites have various manners for instruction and some apparent influence from a banking model of education that goes across both India and the Dominican Republic. It tends to be very hierarchical, both in terms of classroom dynamics, but also in terms of sort of the ability for students to appear as contributors. Second, the students seem to be charged with responsibility and strive to learn at all times, sometimes despite instruction. And so some of the students had told me that while in the Dominican Republic they would go to class because they had some sort of participation grade that was integrated, so they would show up. In India, that's not the way that things are evaluated, and so sometimes they show up, sometimes they don't. They have the exams at the end of the term that they know they have to pass, and they have to answer these questions. And so going to class when you have a less than effective instruction becomes somewhat irrelevant. And lastly, the curriculum does not provide for an engagement on certain current topics, and that would be in North Atlantic anthropologies. So discussions of the Anthropocene, completely absent. Anything of ontological terms or even world anthropologies, none of this stuff was brought up in the curricula in a graduate program there. So it's not to say that it should have been, it's simply making the observation, this is what's going on. So there's going to be perhaps a disconnect, communication of academic knowledge here. So to conclude, the sites around the world have different structures and infrastructures for anthropological education and work. And the higher educational institutions and the history must examine all the cultural dynamics, not just those in the classroom. I hinted at two of those at the beginning. There are many different ways to thinking about becoming an anthropologist, being credentialed as an anthropologist. It goes beyond simply getting a degree. And lastly, the creation of expert scientific knowledge is situated and context dependent. I also wanted to speak just a little bit more to the world anthropologies, because even though, for example, Akhil Gupta mentioned that the US scholarship on India is not imperial and somewhat irrelevant, but the role of many US anthropologists and the figures largely in the curriculum. So, I mean, soul tax, which is practically not taught in US anthropology, figures largely in many Indian anthropology programs. And other US scholars are being integrated and taught, going through almost what it seems like almost the Columbia canon of Boas and Mead and Leslie White and whatnot. And so it becomes very curious to think about whether maybe US scholarship on India is not imperial, but perhaps there is some sort of imperialism of academic knowledge production. So that's what I just want to present. Thank you so much for your time.